They say power corrupts, but what happens when absolute power falls into the hands of a child who hasn't learned right from wrong? Rome found out the hard way when 8-year-old Elagabalus took the throne and turned the empire into his personal house of horrors. Before diving into this shocking tale of childhood gone wrong, if you enjoy learning about the dark truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these disturbing historical stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about humanity's darkest chapters. The year was 2118 AD, and the Roman Empire was in chaos. Emperor Caracalla had been assassinated, and his successor Macrinus was struggling to maintain control. But in the distant province of Syria, a grandmother named Julia Maesa saw an opportunity that would change history forever, and not for the better. Her grandson Varius Avitus Bassianus was only 14 years old, but Julia Maesa had a plan that was as brilliant as it was catastrophic. She would claim that this boy was the illegitimate son of the beloved former Emperor Caracalla, making him the rightful heir to the throne. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. The boy she was promoting wasn't just any teenager. He was already showing signs of the disturbing behavior that would later terrorize Rome. The boy, who would become known as Elagabalus, had been raised as a priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal. From childhood, he had been taught that he was divine, that his word was law, and that ordinary human rules didn't apply to him. Imagine the psychological impact of telling a child that he is literally a god. Now imagine giving that same child the power to back up his delusions. Julia Maesa's plot succeeded beyond her wildest dreams and worst nightmares. The Syrian legions declared Elagabalus emperor, and through a series of battles and political maneuvering, the teenage boy found himself ruler of the known world. But there was one problem that even his cunning grandmother hadn't anticipated. Elagabalus was even younger than they had claimed. Recent historical analysis suggests that when Elagabalus took power, he may have been as young as 8 years old, not the 14 that was publicly announced. Picture this scene. A child who should have been playing with toys was instead playing with human lives, making decisions that affected millions of people across 3 continents. The first signs of trouble came during his coronation ceremony. While previous emperors had shown at least token respect for Roman traditions, Elagabalus immediately began making demands that shocked even the most jaded courtiers. He insisted that his Syrian god be placed above Jupiter in the Roman pantheon. He demanded that senators bow before him, not just as emperor, but as a living deity. And when some of the older senators hesitated, the boy emperor spoke words that would become tragically familiar: kill them. What followed was one of the most bizarre and terrifying periods in Roman history. Elagabalus didn't just order executions, he turned them into entertainment. Palace sources describe scenes that sound more like the fever dreams of a disturbed child than the policies of a Roman emperor. The young emperor would hold trials in the palace courtyard, where he would play judge, jury, and executioner. These weren't real legal proceedings. They were the games of a child who had been given deadly toys. He would accuse senators of imaginary crimes, sometimes based on dreams he claimed to have received from his god. Other times he would order deaths simply because he didn't like someone's face or the way they walked. One particularly disturbing account describes how Elagabalus would organize elaborate dinner parties where guests never knew if they would leave alive. The boy emperor would watch his guests eat and drink, studying their faces, and then randomly select people for execution before dessert was served. Imagine sitting at that table, trying to maintain a normal conversation, while an 8-year-old decided whether you would see tomorrow. The palace staff lived in constant terror. Servants who displeased the young emperor by serving food he didn't like, by making too much noise, or simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time, would find themselves on his death lists. He kept these lists like other children might keep collections of toys or coins, constantly adding new names and checking off those who had already been eliminated. What made Elagabalus particularly terrifying wasn't just his willingness to kill, but the creative ways he found to do it. The boy emperor seemed to view executions as a form of artistic expression, constantly inventing new methods that would satisfy his twisted imagination. He would order people to be thrown to wild animals, but not in the traditional Roman arena setting. Instead, he would have exotic beasts brought to the palace gardens, turning his home into a private coliseum where death was entertainment for an audience of one. Palace records describe how he would clap his hands with delight when his victims were torn apart, as if watching a particularly exciting puppet show. Other times, he would order mass drownings in the palace pools, forcing his victims to wear weighted clothing so they couldn't swim to safety. He found particular pleasure in the panic and desperation of people fighting for their lives in water, often throwing bread crusts to them as if they were animals in a zoo. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the psychological tortures he devised. Elagabalus would sometimes spare people's lives but force them to watch as their family members were executed. He would make parents choose which of their children would die, or force siblings to compete in deadly games where only one could survive. These weren't the calculated cruelties of an adult psychopath, they were the thoughtless experiments of a child who had never learned empathy or consequences. Under Elagabalus, the imperial palace became something out of a nightmare. The boy emperor's bedroom was decorated with the severed heads of his enemies, which he claimed helped him sleep better. He would hold conversations with these gruesome trophies, asking their advice on matters of state and becoming angry when they didn't respond. The palace corridors echoed with the sounds of constant fear. Courtiers walked on tiptoe, spoke in whispers, and avoided making eye contact with the young emperor. They never knew what might trigger one of his violent outbursts. He might order someone's death because they sneezed during an audience, or because their clothing was a color he suddenly decided he didn't like. Elagabalus also had a fascination with watching people die slowly. He would order his physicians to keep condemned prisoners alive for as long as possible during their executions, so he could study their expressions and reactions. He kept detailed notes about how different people responded to pain and fear, like a child conducting cruel experiments on insects. The boy emperor's cruelty wasn't limited to adults. Children who displeased him, whether they were the offspring of nobles or the sons and daughters of palace servants, faced the same brutal fate as grown men and women. He seemed incapable of distinguishing between different types of people. To him, everyone was simply a plaything for his amusement. Even by the brutal standards of ancient Rome, Elagabalus had gone too far. The Senate, the military, and even his own family began to realize that the boy emperor wasn't just eccentric or difficult. He was genuinely dangerous to the stability of the empire. Every day he remained in power, more innocent people died for no reason other than a child's whims. The final straw came when Elagabalus announced his intention to move the capital of the empire from Rome to Syria, and to replace all Roman gods with his Syrian deity. But it wasn't these grandiose plans that sealed his fate. It was his daily murders of prominent citizens that had created too many enemies to ignore. His own grandmother, Julia Maesa, the woman who had orchestrated his rise to power, began plotting his downfall. She had gotten what she wanted, power for her family, but the cost had become too high. Even she couldn't stomach the monster she had helped create. The conspiracy against Elagabalus included members of his own Praetorian Guard, men whose job was to protect him, but who had grown sickened by his cruelty. They had watched him order the deaths of their colleagues, their friends, and their families. The boy who had inspired fear had finally inspired something more dangerous: desperate courage. In March 22 AD, after nearly 4 years of terror, the 12-year-old emperor's reign came to a violent end. The Praetorian Guard, led by officers who could no longer stomach his cruelties, surrounded him in the palace. For the first time in his short life, Elagabalus found himself powerless. The boy who had ordered so many deaths begged for his life, promising to change, promising to be good. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and Rome demanded justice for the hundreds of innocent people who had died to satisfy a child's bloodlust. When they killed him, Elagabalus was still just a child, a monster, yes, but a child nonetheless. His body, along with that of his mother who had enabled his cruelties, was dragged through the streets of Rome and thrown into the Tiber River. The crowds cheered as if a terrible curse had finally been lifted from their city. Elagabalus ruled Rome for less than 4 years, but his impact on history serves as one of the most extreme examples of what happens when power is given to someone too young and too damaged to understand its consequences. His story raises disturbing questions about nature versus nurture, about the corrupting influence of absolute power, and about the adults who enable children's worst impulses. Modern psychologists studying his case suggest that Elagabalus displayed classic signs of conduct disorder, antisocial personality traits, and possible psychopathy, all made infinitely more dangerous by his position as emperor. He was a child who had never been told no, never faced consequences for his actions, and never learned that other people were real human beings rather than toys for his amusement. Perhaps most tragically, his story shows how quickly a civilization can descend into chaos when power falls into the wrong hands. Rome survived Elagabalus, but barely. The damage he inflicted on the empire's institutions, its people's trust in leadership, and its international reputation took decades to repair. The boy emperor's tomb, if it ever existed, has never been found. Some historians believe his supporters secretly buried him, while others think his body was completely destroyed by the angry mob. But his legacy lives on as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of protecting children, even royal children, from the corrupting influences that can turn innocence into evil. Today, when we look back at the reign of Elagabalus, we see not just a historical curiosity, but a cautionary tale about what happens when a society fails to protect its most vulnerable members, including those who seem to hold all the power. The 8-year-old who ordered mass executions reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who should be in our care. To truly understand how an 8-year-old could become one of history's most feared rulers, we need to examine the psychological factors that created this monster. Modern child psychology offers disturbing insights into what went wrong in Elagabalus's development, and how a combination of genetics, environment, and circumstance can produce a perfect storm of evil. From birth, Elagabalus was raised in an environment where violence was normalized and power was worshipped. His family, the Severan dynasty, had come to power through military conquest and maintained their position through brutal suppression of rivals. The boy grew up watching his relatives order executions, confiscate property, and destroy entire families who posed threats to their rule. But it wasn't just the family environment that shaped him. As a child priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal, he was literally trained to believe he was divine. Imagine the psychological impact of being told from the age of 3 or 4 that you are a god walking among mortals. Every day, priests and worshippers would bow before him, offer him prayers, and treat his every word as sacred command. This divine conditioning had devastating effects on his developing brain. Normal children learn empathy through interaction with peers, through being told no, through experiencing consequences for their actions. Elagabalus experienced none of this. He was never contradicted, never punished, never forced to consider how his actions affected others. Child psychologists today recognize this as a textbook case of what they call empathy deficit disorder, a condition where children fail to develop the ability to understand or care about other people's feelings. In most cases, this can be treated with therapy and proper guidance, but when combined with absolute power, it becomes something far more dangerous. The progression from normal child to monster didn't happen overnight. Palace records, preserved in fragments, show a gradual escalation of violent behavior that should have been alarming to any responsible adult. But the adults around Elagabalus weren't responsible. They were either too afraid to intervene or too invested in maintaining their own power through him. His first recorded act of cruelty occurred when he was approximately 6 years old, still living in Syria before his rise to power. During a religious ceremony, a dove that was supposed to be sacrificed to his god managed to escape from the altar. Instead of simply catching another bird, the young Elagabalus ordered that the priest who had allowed the escape be beaten. When the beating didn't satisfy him, he demanded that the man's fingers be cut off, one by one, until the dove was recaptured. This incident reveals several disturbing patterns that would define his later reign. First, his disproportionate response to minor problems. The escaped dove became cause for severe mutilation. Second, his need for ritual and symbolism. The punishment had to match the crime in his twisted logic. Third, his complete lack of empathy for the suffering he caused. The priest's pain was irrelevant compared to his own satisfaction. As he grew older, these incidents became more frequent and more severe. He would order servants beaten for bringing him food he didn't want, or for looking at him without permission. He developed elaborate punishment systems where different crimes received different tortures. A slave who spilled wine might lose a hand. A guard who fell asleep might have his eyes put out. A cook who underseasoned his food might be forced to eat burning coals. What made these childhood cruelties particularly ominous was their calculated nature. These weren't angry outbursts or momentary lapses in judgment. They were carefully planned and executed punishments that the boy seemed to enjoy. Witnesses described how his face would light up with genuine pleasure when watching someone suffer, as if their pain was the most entertaining thing he had ever seen. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Elagabalus's story isn't what he did, but how the adults around him allowed and encouraged his behavior. His rise to power required the active cooperation of hundreds of people who knew exactly what kind of child they were promoting. His grandmother Julia Maesa was the primary architect of his elevation to emperor, but she wasn't naive about his character. Palace records show that she received multiple reports about his violent tendencies years before she began her campaign to make him emperor. She chose to ignore these warnings because she saw his cruelty as a useful tool for maintaining power. In her correspondence with Syrian nobles, Julia Maesa explicitly discussed how Elagabalus's divine ruthlessness would help them control the Roman Senate. She viewed his lack of empathy not as a flaw to be corrected, but as an asset to be exploited. In one surviving letter, she writes, "The boy's willingness to shed blood will serve us well when we must eliminate our enemies in Rome." His mother, Julia Soaemius, played an equally disturbing role. Instead of protecting her son from the corrupting influences of power, she actively encouraged his worst impulses. She would praise him when he ordered executions, telling him that his cruelty proved his divine nature. She commissioned artists to create paintings and sculptures depicting her son as a warrior god surrounded by the bodies of his enemies. The military commanders who supported his claim to the throne were perhaps the most cynical enablers of all. They knew that putting an unstable child in charge of the Roman Empire was dangerous, but they calculated that they could control him and use his authority for their own purposes. They were wrong, of course. Elagabalus proved to be uncontrollable by anyone, but their willingness to gamble with the lives of millions shows the depth of their moral corruption. Even the palace staff played a role in creating the monster. Servants who witnessed his early acts of cruelty chose to remain silent rather than risk his anger. Guards who saw him torture animals looked the other way. Tutors who were supposed to teach him right from wrong instead taught him languages and mathematics while ignoring his psychological development. This conspiracy of silence and enablement created a perfect environment for evil to flourish. Every adult who should have protected other people from Elagabalus instead protected Elagabalus from consequences, allowing his cruelty to grow unchecked until it consumed everything around him. To understand the true horror of Elagabalus's reign, we need to examine what daily life was like for ordinary people living under his rule. Palace servants, government officials, and even high-ranking nobles never knew if they would survive from one day to the next, as the boy emperor's moods shifted without warning or reason. Morning audiences with the emperor became exercises in terror. Courtiers would arrive at the palace before dawn, spending hours in preparation not just for presenting their business, but for surviving the encounter. They would rehearse their words carefully, knowing that a single phrase interpreted as disrespectful could mean death. They would choose their clothing based on the boy emperor's known preferences, avoiding colors or styles that might trigger his anger. But no amount of preparation could guarantee safety, because Elagabalus's decisions often made no logical sense. He might execute someone for bowing too deeply, claiming they were mocking his authority, or he might kill someone for not bowing deeply enough, interpreting it as defiance. The arbitrary nature of his violence was itself a form of psychological torture, keeping everyone around him in a constant state of fear and uncertainty. The palace became a maze of hidden passages and secret exits, as staff members tried to avoid unexpected encounters with their young ruler. Servants would communicate through hand signals to warn each other when he was approaching. They developed elaborate systems for staying out of his sight, rotating duties so that no one person had to spend too much time in his presence. Kitchen staff faced particular dangers, as Elagabalus took a perverse interest in his food and the people who prepared it. He would sometimes demand to watch meals being cooked, standing over chefs and tasting ingredients. If anything displeased him, if the meat was too tough, if the bread wasn't warm enough, if the wine wasn't properly mixed, he would order immediate punishment for the entire kitchen staff. These weren't simple beatings or brief imprisonments. Elagabalus had developed a sophisticated understanding of torture techniques, studying methods used in gladiator training and military interrogation. Kitchen staff who displeased him might find themselves suspended over cooking fires or forced to eat scalding food until their mouths were burned beyond repair. The psychological impact on palace workers was devastating. Many developed what we would now recognize as severe anxiety disorders, unable to sleep or eat properly due to constant fear. Some began showing signs of dissociation, mentally detaching from their bodies during interactions with the emperor as a way of coping with trauma. Others experienced complete psychological breaks, found wandering the palace halls in confused states, muttering to themselves about invisible threats. The horror of Elagabalus's reign wasn't confined to the palace walls. His violence and instability sent shockwaves throughout the Roman Empire, affecting millions of people who never came within 1,000 miles of Rome itself. Provincial governors, desperate to avoid angering the unpredictable boy emperor, began implementing increasingly harsh policies in their territories. They reasoned that if they could demonstrate their loyalty through brutal suppression of any potential dissent, they might survive his reign. This led to a cascade of violence throughout the empire as local officials competed to prove their ruthlessness. In Britain, the governor ordered mass executions of tribal leaders who had been peaceful for decades, claiming they posed threats to imperial security. In Egypt, tax collectors were given permission to use torture to extract payments, leading to widespread suffering among farmers and merchants. In Spain, entire villages were destroyed based on rumors of disloyalty, as officials feared that any sign of unrest might be reported to Rome. The economic impact was equally devastating. Trade networks that had functioned smoothly for centuries began to break down as merchants became afraid to travel. Who would risk a business journey when the emperor might decide to execute all foreign traders on a whim? Agricultural production declined as farmers fled to remote areas, hoping to avoid the attention of imperial officials who might be looking for scapegoats to offer to their unstable ruler. The military, traditionally the backbone of Roman power, began to show signs of serious strain. Soldiers who had sworn oaths to protect the empire found themselves ordered to carry out meaningless massacres of civilians. Some units refused these orders and were themselves destroyed by loyal forces. Others followed their commands but suffered massive defections as individual soldiers chose exile or death over participation in the madness. Perhaps most tragically, the emperor's instability encouraged others throughout the empire to embrace similar violence. Local strongmen and petty officials, seeing that cruelty was rewarded at the highest levels, began implementing their own reign of terror in their communities. Children throughout the empire watched adults resolve conflicts through violence and learned that might makes right. The reign of Elagabalus didn't just impact the Roman Empire, it sent ripples throughout the ancient world that changed the course of global history. Neighboring kingdoms and distant trading partners watched in horror as the greatest military power on earth descended into chaos under the rule of a psychotic child. In Persia, the Sassanid Empire began preparing for war, seeing Rome's instability as an opportunity to reclaim territories lost in previous conflicts. Persian spies reported back that the Roman military was demoralized and the government was paralyzed by fear of their own ruler. King Ardashir I began moving troops toward the Roman border, planning invasions that would likely have succeeded if Elagabalus had remained in power longer. Germanic tribes along the northern frontier also sensed weakness and began probing Roman defenses. Tribal leaders who had maintained peaceful relationships with Rome for generations started preparing for raids, knowing that the Roman response would be chaotic and ineffective under a child emperor who was more interested in palace murders than military strategy. The economic relationships that Rome had built with trading partners from India to Britain began to deteriorate. Merchants from distant lands who had traveled to Rome for centuries reported back about the dangerous instability they witnessed. Indian spice traders spoke of senators being executed for imaginary crimes. Chinese silk merchants described seeing the emperor torture palace staff for entertainment. These stories spread throughout the trading networks, damaging Rome's reputation and reducing its economic influence. Religious communities throughout the empire also suffered under Elagabalus's rule. His attempts to impose Syrian religious practices on Roman citizens led to widespread unrest and rebellion. Christian communities, already persecuted under previous emperors, faced even harsher treatment as the boy emperor saw their refusal to worship him as a direct challenge to his divinity. Jewish communities faced particularly severe persecution as Elagabalus blamed them for various military setbacks and economic problems. He ordered the destruction of synagogues and the confiscation of religious texts, driving many Jewish families into exile or underground. These persecutions would have lasting effects on Jewish-Roman relations for centuries to come. The intellectual and cultural damage was equally severe. Scholars and philosophers who had found patronage under previous emperors fled Rome or went into hiding. Libraries were neglected or destroyed. Artistic projects were abandoned as craftsmen feared that their work might somehow offend the unstable ruler. The cultural flowering that had characterized earlier periods of Roman history came to an abrupt halt. Modern forensic psychology offers disturbing insights into what might have been happening in Elagabalus's developing brain. By analyzing the historical records of his behavior, mental health experts have identified several key factors that contributed to his transformation from innocent child to monster. Brain development research shows that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and moral reasoning, doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s. This means that even normal children have limited ability to understand consequences or control their impulses. When you combine this natural limitation with trauma, abuse, and unlimited power, the results can be catastrophic. Elagabalus showed classic signs of what psychologists now call callous unemotional traits, a condition characterized by lack of empathy, shallow emotions, and disregard for others' welfare. In modern children, these traits are often the result of genetic predisposition combined with environmental factors like abuse, neglect, or exposure to violence. His obsession with religious rituals and divine authority suggests possible obsessive compulsive tendencies, but channeled through a framework of unlimited power rather than anxiety. Where a normal child with OCD might obsessively wash their hands or arrange their toys, Elagabalus obsessively arranged executions and torture sessions, finding comfort in the ritualistic nature of violence. The boy emperor also displayed signs of what psychologists call instrumental aggression, violence used as a tool to achieve goals, rather than as an emotional response to anger or frustration. His executions weren't crimes of passion, they were calculated decisions designed to maintain power, eliminate threats, or simply provide entertainment. This type of cold, purposeful cruelty is often seen in adult psychopaths, but is extremely rare and disturbing when it appears in children. Perhaps most chillingly, Elagabalus seemed to experience genuine pleasure from others' suffering, a trait that psychologists call sadism. Normal children might occasionally be cruel to insects or animals as they explore cause and effect, but they typically show remorse when they understand they've caused pain. Elagabalus never showed any remorse. Instead, he seemed to actively seek out opportunities to cause suffering. His lack of normal social bonds is another red flag identified by modern psychologists. Healthy children form attachments to caregivers, friends, and even pets. These relationships teach empathy and provide emotional regulation. Elagabalus formed no genuine relationships with anyone, viewing all other people as tools to be used or obstacles to be eliminated. Several attempts were made during Elagabalus's reign to moderate his behavior or limit his power, but all failed due to a combination of political constraints, fear, and the boy emperor's growing paranoia. Understanding these failed interventions provides insight into how evil can become unstoppable when it reaches a certain level of power. The Roman Senate, traditionally a check on imperial power, found itself completely paralyzed by fear. Several senior senators attempted to organize opposition to the boy emperor's worst excesses, but their efforts were discovered and the conspirators were executed in particularly gruesome ways. After these examples, most senators chose survival over resistance, enabling Elagabalus's behavior through their silence. His own family members, who might have been expected to provide guidance or control, were either complicit in his crimes or too afraid to intervene. His mother actively encouraged his cruelty, while his grandmother focused on maintaining the family's political position rather than addressing his psychological problems. Other relatives who might have spoken up were systematically eliminated as the boy emperor grew more paranoid about potential threats to his authority. The Praetorian Guard, whose job was to protect the emperor, found themselves in an impossible position. They were sworn to obey Elagabalus, but their orders often involved participating in obviously criminal acts. Some guards attempted to refuse these orders and were immediately executed. Others tried to modify or delay his commands, hoping to minimize damage, but this only increased his suspicion and led to more violence. Religious leaders who might have provided moral guidance were either terrified into silence or actively recruited to support his claims of divinity. The boy emperor surrounded himself with priests and mystics who reinforced his grandiose delusions rather than challenging them. Traditional Roman religious authorities were either exiled or murdered if they questioned his theological innovations. Foreign diplomats and visiting dignitaries witnessed the horror but were powerless to intervene directly in Roman internal affairs. Some tried to work behind the scenes, offering support to potential rebels or providing intelligence to opposition groups, but these efforts were largely ineffective, as Elagabalus's paranoia made it nearly impossible for any organized resistance to develop. Perhaps most tragically, the boy emperor's own psychological condition made intervention nearly impossible. By the time he reached Rome, his delusions of divinity were so deeply entrenched that he genuinely believed he was a god with the right to kill anyone for any reason. He interpreted all attempts at guidance or control as attacks on his divine authority, responding with even greater violence. The plot that finally ended Elagabalus's reign was different from previous failed attempts because it included his own grandmother, Julia Maia, the woman who had originally orchestrated his rise to power. Her decision to turn against him reveals the depths of horror that his rule had reached. Even his most powerful supporter could no longer tolerate the monster she had helped create. Julia Maia's conversion from enabler to enemy didn't happen overnight. For months, she watched as her grandson's violence escalated beyond anything she had anticipated. The executions were no longer limited to political enemies or potential threats. They had become random acts of cruelty that served no purpose other than the boy emperor's entertainment. The final straw came when Elagabalus began threatening members of his own family. His paranoia had grown to the point where he suspected everyone of plotting against him, including his closest relatives. When he ordered the torture of a young cousin who had allegedly looked at him disrespectfully, Julia Maia realized that no one was safe, not even those who had supported him from the beginning. Her decision to act wasn't motivated by moral outrage or concern for the empire. It was pure survival instinct. She understood that if Elagabalus continued on his current path, he would eventually destroy the entire Severan dynasty, including herself. The boy who was supposed to secure her family's power had become its greatest threat. Julia Maius began reaching out to other potential conspirators, but she had to be extraordinarily careful. Elagabalus had developed an extensive network of spies and informants who reported directly to him. Anyone suspected of disloyalty faced immediate execution, often along with their entire family. The conspiracy had to be planned in absolute secrecy, with communications hidden in seemingly innocent interactions. The key breakthrough came when Julia Maiosa managed to recruit several officers in the Praetorian Guard who had grown disgusted with the orders they were forced to carry out. These men had joined the Guard to protect Rome and serve the empire, not to participate in the torture and murder of innocent people. Their professional pride and personal honor had been systematically destroyed by years of serving as instruments of a child's cruelty. The conspiracy also included members of the palace household staff who had witnessed the boy emperor's crimes firsthand, servants who had watched their colleagues tortured and killed for trivial offenses were desperate for an end to the nightmare. Their intimate knowledge of Elagabalus's daily routines and security arrangements proved crucial to the plot's success. Perhaps most importantly, the conspirators managed to recruit Alexander Severus, Elagabalus's cousin, as an alternative emperor. Alexander was only 13 years old himself, but he had shown none of his cousin's psychopathic tendencies. He was quiet, studious, and appeared genuinely horrified by Elagabalus's behavior. The conspirators calculated that replacing one child emperor with another was risky, but Alexander couldn't possibly be worse than the monster currently on the throne. The actual execution of the plot was swift and decisive. On March 11th, 22 AD, the conspirators struck during a routine palace ceremony. Elagabalus was surrounded by guards he trusted, in a place where he felt completely safe. When the attack began, he was too shocked to react effectively. For the first time in his life, his commands were ignored as the people around him revealed their true loyalties. The boy emperor's final moments were reportedly pathetic rather than dramatic. Faced with real violence directed at himself rather than others, he broke down completely, begging for mercy and promising to change his behavior. But it was far too late for mercy. The people he had terrorized for 4 years were not interested in his promises or his tears. The immediate aftermath of Elagabalus's death revealed the true extent of the trauma his reign had inflicted on the Roman Empire. The relief felt by ordinary citizens was overwhelming, but it was mixed with a deep shame about what they had allowed to happen. How had the greatest civilization in human history permitted itself to be ruled by a psychotic child? The new emperor, Alexander Severus, faced the enormous task of rebuilding institutions that had been systematically destroyed by his predecessor's madness. The Senate had to be reconstituted with new members to replace those who had been murdered. The Praetorian Guard needed to be purged of officers who had been too willing to carry out atrocities. The entire imperial administration had to be reorganized to remove people who had enabled or participated in the reign of terror. But perhaps the most difficult challenge was psychological rather than administrative. The people of Rome had been traumatized by years of arbitrary violence and constant fear. Citizens had learned to keep their heads down, avoid attention, and never express opinions that might be interpreted as criticism. This culture of fear and submission didn't disappear overnight just because the tyrant was dead. The official response was to engage in what historians call damnato memoria, the systematic erasure of Elagabalus from historical records. His name was chiseled off monuments, his statues were destroyed, and his coins were melted down. Official histories were rewritten to minimize his reign or skip over it entirely. The goal was to pretend that the nightmare had never happened. This deliberate forgetting had serious consequences for future generations. By refusing to honestly examine what had gone wrong, Rome failed to develop safeguards against similar catastrophes. The lessons that might have been learned from Elagabalus's reign were lost, making it more likely that future rulers would repeat similar patterns of abuse. The international damage took much longer to repair. Rome's reputation for stability and effective governance had been severely damaged, and it would take decades of careful diplomacy and successful military campaigns to restore confidence in Roman power. Some territories that had declared independence during the chaos were never successfully reintegrated into the empire. The psychological scars left on survivors were profound and lasting. People who had lived through Elagabalus's reign never fully recovered their sense of security or trust in authority. They passed their trauma to their children, creating generations of Romans who were psychologically prepared for tyranny and oppression. The story of Elagabalus offers disturbing lessons that remain relevant in the modern world. His reign demonstrates how quickly civilized societies can descend into barbarism when proper checks and balances are removed, and how dangerous it can be to give unlimited power to individuals who lack the psychological maturity to handle it responsibly. Child development experts studying his case emphasize the importance of early intervention when children show signs of callous or aggressive behavior. Many of the warning signs that Elagabalus displayed, cruelty to animals, lack of empathy, pleasure in others' suffering, can be addressed through proper therapy and guidance if caught early enough. But his story shows what can happen when these red flags are ignored, or worse, encouraged by adults who should know better. The role of enablers in his rise to power is particularly relevant to modern discussions of institutional abuse and corruption. Julia Maeza and the other adults who supported Elagabalus weren't naive about his character. They knew exactly what kind of person they were promoting. They chose to enable his behavior because they thought they could control him and use his power for their own benefit. This pattern repeats throughout history whenever adults prioritize their own interests over the welfare of children and society. Political scientists studying authoritarian regimes find parallels between Elagabalus's reign and modern dictatorships. The arbitrary nature of his violence, the climate of fear he created, and the way his instability corrupted institutions throughout the empire are all characteristic of tyrannical governments. His story reminds us that democracy and the rule of law are fragile achievements that can be destroyed surprisingly quickly when the wrong people gain power. Mental health professionals emphasize that Elagabalus's story is not an argument against giving children authority or responsibility, but rather a cautionary tale about the importance of proper psychological support and guidance for young people in positions of power. Most children, even those born into royal families, develop normally when provided with appropriate boundaries, consequences, and moral education. The conspiracy of silence that allowed his crimes to continue also offers lessons for modern institutions dealing with abuse. The palace servants, government officials, and military officers who witnessed his cruelty but chose to remain silent were not inherently evil people. They were ordinary individuals trapped in an impossible situation where speaking up meant death. Their story illustrates the importance of creating safe channels for reporting abuse and protecting whistleblowers who risk their own safety to expose wrongdoing. Perhaps most importantly, Elagabalus's reign demonstrates the cumulative effect of seemingly small moral compromises. His transformation from troubled child to monster didn't happen overnight. It was the result of hundreds of decisions by dozens of adults who chose convenience over conscience, power over principle, and personal safety over public welfare. His story stands as one of history's most chilling examples of childhood innocence transformed into pure evil, a reminder that power without wisdom, compassion without consequences, and authority without accountability can create horrors that echo through the ages. The 8-year-old emperor who ordered mass executions remains a warning from the past about the monsters we might create when we fail to protect both society from dangerous individuals and dangerous individuals from the corrupting influence of unchecked power.